A True War Experience. Undertones of War, published in 1928, is a memoir by Edmund Blunden. Edmund Blunden was also a published and famous poet in the 20th century. Here's one of his poems, Pillbox, which was published in Undertones of War. Just see what's happening, Warley. Warley rose, and round the angled doorway thrust his nose. And Sergeant Hode went too, to snuff the air. Then War brought down his fists, and missed the pair. Yet Hode was scratched by a splinter, the blood came, and out burst terrors that he'd striven to tame. A good man, Hode for weeks. I'm blown to bits, he groans, he screams. Come, bluffer, where's your wits? Says Warley, bluffer, you've a blighty man. All in the pillbox urged him, here began. His freedom, think of Eastbourne and your dad. Poor man lay at length, and brief and mad, flung out his cry of doom, soon ebbed and dumb. He yielded, Warley, with a tot of rum, and shooting in his face could not restore him. The ship of Carron over channel bore him. All marveled, even on that most deathly day, to see this life so spirited away. Edmund Blunden's memoir, Undertones of War, gives readers an insight into the brutality and tragic beauty found on the Western Front of World War I. When World War I battles come to mind, Blunden illustrates the classic aspects of them, such as the liberal use of artillery, the life in the trenches, and the bonds made between soldiers. Blunden uniquely describes how all these events unfolded for himself as well as the entire front. As a result, Blunden unlocks an interesting window of interpretation, because he entered the war as a writer, which gave him a distinct view on how the war was fought, how new technologies affected the soldiers, and what his own place was in the war. Born in London, Blunden grew up in an upper-middle-class household. Edmund was the child of 2 English headmasters, and as a result his family put a high value on education. It is no surprise then that Blunden attended the prestigious Oxford University. With this education, Blunden is able to relay the sights and sounds of World War I in a beautifully poetic fashion. To open up his memoir, he justifies the reason for writing such a piece because, if these things are so, it is now or never, for the rendering, however discolored and lacunary, which I propose. The explanation for writing this is even written in a way that sets the tone for the entire memoir to show that his experience during the war was the classic Western Front tale, but seen through the eyes of an educated young writer, giving people who did not experience the war a chance to understand what the lost generation of men truly lost. Pillbox is a great example of how Edmund used his beautiful writing to show his audience what he went through and saw while on the front lines during World War I. Technology has a great deal of importance and impact on World War I and the way in which it was fought. World War I was the first war fought with modern-day technology, meaning long-range, accurate artillery was used in conjunction with automatic weapons and the ability to mobilize large amounts of resources and men in a quick fashion. These technologies, paired with a population that was, as Blunden describes, had a wish to be sent quickly to the front, made World War I a very costly war. Edmund perfectly paints a picture of just how devastating these new technologies made fighting. After a British advance, Blunden describes the men who were repelled as none had returned without bullet holes in their caps, uniforms, or equipment. Every man who moved out of the trench and attempted to move forward against German lines was in some way affected. After the attack, Blunden describes his trench as Aceldama. Blunden evinces his knowledge that was uncommon for those on the front at this time by making such a vivid biblical reference. Edmund Blunden does not hesitate to comment on aspects of the fighting that he does not agree with. World War I was the first war in hundreds of years to bring back the steel helmets, and interestingly enough, Blunden prefers his soft caps to the ugly utility of steel helmets. It is not surprising that Blunden holds these notions because of his poetic view of life. A steel helmet would dampen the beautiful colors that came with the caps which make war, though a very brutal activity, into a somewhat orderly and almost aesthetically pleasing practice, according to Blunden. Blunden even states, the dethronement of the soft caps clearly symbolized the change of the character of the war. War went from being looked at as a contest between gentlemen and their subjects to becoming a nasty, harsh, and brutal affair. Hundreds of miles from the front, across the English Channel, Many citizens of the British Empire closely followed the events on the Western Front to see how the British expeditionary forces fared during the war. Positive frontline experience was highly sought after by the British government. Their goal was to publish those accounts in popular newspapers to boost morale on the home front. Edmund Blunden had a few of his poems published in a prominent British magazine while he was on the front. As a result of this, Blunden's commanders took great pride in having a published author in their battalion. Thus Blunden gained prestige in his battalion and among his superiors. As his battalion moved towards the Battle of the Somme, Edmund was put in charge of doing more administrative work for the trenches, like picking where to put explosives and ammunition for soldiers to use in the trenches, and less of being on the front line of the trench. Obviously, he was still in danger, but he was much more secure doing that than simply being on the front. Part of the reason he held that position was because of his writing skills, which paired with his rank set him apart from the rest of the men in his battalion. Though Blunden does talk and mention the famous battles he was a part of, Blunden focuses more on how they lived, survived, and the relationship between the grunts and the commanding officers. This unique aspect gives insight into soldiers' interactions and true day-to-day living conditions. On the one hand, there was the battalion's headquarters at the Battle of Ypres, located on the grounds of a chateau. It was described to have statues of Venus located on it, showing the almost luxurious living conditions the commanders on the front enjoyed. Conversely, the soldiers stationed on the front had living conditions that were described by Blunden as being crude and inhumane at Ypres. Surprisingly, though, there is never really any mention of tension between the officers and the soldiers enduring the brunt of the fighting on the front. Even with the incredibly varying living conditions of the two groups, a reason for this might have been that Blunden enjoyed a spot that placed him in between, and thus made him miss such tension. Being seen in a favorable light by his superiors because of his talent as a writer, and being a respected officer by his soldiers, lent him to have the ability to have a casual oblivion to this aspect of the war. Blunden's background as a writer gives him an intriguing view on how the war was fought, and his relationship with his fellow soldiers and superiors make Blunden's World War I experience distinct from many other accounts of the Great War. Though Edmund left the war with no physical scars, the war left profound mental damage on Blunden that would never leave him, much like many soldiers who fought in World War I. Fortunately for Edmund Blunden, these mental scars did not impair his future. Rather, they drove him to accomplish great works. After the war, he attended classes with famous contemporaries and good friends such as Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves. Sassoon and Blunden were in contact throughout the war and after. This contact was one of the inspirations Blunden had to write down his experiences. Blunden left a legacy of writing that many regard as one of the most true war memoirs ever written, which has influenced how war is portrayed in both popular culture and how others who go to war view their own experiences.